Welcome everybody, thanks for coming down. My name is Brian Reisick. I am the actual Olympus technical representative. What we're going to do is we're going to go over some Digital 101 basically subjects about how to take pictures. First of all, pixel resolution. You have an option to lower or raise the actual image quality. 12 megapixel resolution is an image resolution that you would shoot large images. If you're going to purchase a camera today and the majority of printing would be 4x6s, you really don't need a 12 megapixel camera. 12 megapixel camera, like I said, is a very high resolution. You'll be able to make images easily 16x20 on a 12 megapixel camera. Aspect ratios, Olympus usually uses a 4:3 aspect ratio. It's very close to an 8x10. You're not actually cutting pixels off if you were to make an 8x10. Some other cameras use 3:2. It's a little bit more elongated. That's more conducive for, let's say, a 4x6. White balance. Lights have a different color temperature than, let's say, outdoors. There's different you have different types of fluorescent bulbs that create a different color temperature, as well as tungsten. With tungsten lighting, your images are warm. You have like warm skin tones, or images might come up a little bit orangish. JPEG file, it's a file that you use for printing 4x6s. With today's cameras, you can go pretty much a very large image with a JPEG image. TIFF is a tagged image format. Most of your cameras today are not going to have this resolution anymore, simply because that the JPEGs of today and the higher megapixel cameras of today are going to take a JPEG just as good as a TIFF file. TIFF file is basically a large file with no compression. The advantage of RAW is that there's no applied compression, there's no applied sharpening. The only disadvantage with a RAW file is it has to be post-processed. Sharpness needs to be applied, sometimes exposure, sometimes white balance. You have full control over the image. 18% gray, the camera meters for a neutral color, which would be an 18% gray. That's how it determines actual exposure. The 18% gray is very close to a natural skin tone, and that's what basically is a good standard for the camera to make the proper exposure. If you're taking pictures outside in the snow, obviously there's not really a gray or a neutral tones when you're taking pictures out in the snow. That can fool the camera very easily. So most professionals, if they're shooting out in snow, because the camera will read it as gray, will overexpose. So again, if you have the option of changing exposure in your camera, and if you're in a really bright sandy area, or it's sunlight, and you got a lot of light, a lot of white snow, overexpose by a stop or two. That will basically compensate for the camera seeing 18% gray. If you're in a situation where your images are overexposed and your camera's shooting at the fastest possible shutter speed it could possibly do, go to your ISO. Go to a lower ISO. Okay, if you're in an exact opposite situation, let's say if your flash is not powerful enough, I wanted to take a picture of something maybe about 25 feet away, and unfortunately, let's say the flash on my camera is really not bright enough to project on something 25 feet away, you simply compensate by raising the ISO. What that does is that makes the camera much more sensitive to light. If you tend to choose a lower ISO, basically that is probably the best quality that you can shoot your camera in. If you go to a higher ISO, you're going to increase image noise. Aperture is controlled by a number that's called f-stops. The lower the number, the larger the opening. The higher the number, the smaller the opening. Depth of field. If you were to shoot a portrait style picture, you basically want a very shallow depth of field. So I would have to use a smaller number, which creates a larger lens opening. Okay, what that does is that limits the actual depth of focus. So if I was to take a picture of a person, let's say the headshot of a person, and the background is very confusing, I want my point of focus just to be on the subject itself. I don't want that confusing background. That's why I would choose a smaller f number or a larger opening. Larger opening means you're using more of the glass. of the camera's lens. To increase the depth of focus, let's say if I wanted something in the foreground in focus as well as the background, that I would use a larger number, which basically gives me a smaller aperture opening, which increases the depth of field. Shutter speeds basically is the amount of time that you're exposing the image, okay, to the sensor or the camera itself. The slower the shutter speed, the more duration. 1 second exposure is a long duration. I would normally not handhold an image at 1 second. Basically, everybody can hold an image somewhere around 1/60th of a second. Anything slower is going to require either one, image stabilization, or some type of a support device like a tripod. And once you get into the higher shutter speeds over here, you're freezing your action. You're going to require a lot more light to take the picture because you're shooting at such a slow duration. You're going to have to choose a larger lens openings, this way more light can come in as opposed to a smaller lens opening. Aperture priority controls your depth of focus. The camera is going to choose the appropriate shutter speed while you choose how much depth of focus you want. The camera is going to basically match the appropriate shutter speed for a normally exposed image. Shutter speed priority. I would use this specifically if I wanted to control motion, if I wanted to blur the motion, or if I wanted to freeze it. I have the option of choosing a faster or a slower shutter speed while the camera chooses the appropriate aperture for a normal exposed image. I would like to thank everybody for spending the time for the Lunch and Learn class. It was very rewarding for me as well as you. And if anybody's interested, just go to jr.com. Olympus Cameras is a great place to purchase through online.